Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway from the Garrison Church of God. I am glad you joined me today. We're talking about Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. This particular Sunday is special to me. I am pro-life, and I am very proud of that. This particular day remembers the Roe versus Wade decision of 1973 that legalized abortion throughout the United States on demand. It, in my opinion, was a terrible decision, and many people in the area of legal thought have believed that decision was very poorly written. However, many who support abortion on demand believe that because now it is settled law, there is no reason to go back and challenge that. I'm troubled by that because we believe in this country that a child may be killed in the womb up until the very moment of birth. That really frightens me in our culture. In addition to that, I believe that we are created in God's image. And as a result of that, we must respect human life in all aspects. And that is dangerous for a culture that no longer respects human life. The further we go along this road, I believe the more dangerous and difficult that becomes for us. I want to talk to you about God's gift of life to us. If you'd like to join us for service this morning, I'd like to encourage you to come. At Riverdale, I'll be speaking at 8:30 this morning for our service, and I'll be speaking here in Garrison at 10:30 this morning. So I'd invite you to come and be a part of either of these two services. I want to talk to you about God's gift of life. In 1 John chapter 1, it talks about the word of life which we have handled with our hands. In our world, we do not understand how important this issue of abortion has become. In the 1840s, the issue of slavery in the United States became that moral decision point for our nation that would lead us eventually to civil war. The idea was that we as people could not continue to enslave people and use their labor simply because they were of a different color. And that really troubles me, even to this day, that we ever allowed that as a people and as a nation. But it also troubles me just as much that we have allowed those who are unborn to be killed in the womb simply for convenience. That really troubles me. I see those two issues as two sides of the same coin. They have to do with the sanctity of human life. For a black man living in Africa was as sacred to God as a white man living in the United States. God saw both men as equally valuable. He did not believe there was any right to capture that black man in Africa and put him on a confined slave ship where huge numbers of people would die just on the transport. He did not believe it was right for humans to be treated in the way in which they were when they were enslaved in this country. And certainly it was completely inappropriate for Christians of any stripe to support that type of behavior. That is what troubles me even to this day when I look back at what happened during the Civil War. I believe we are at another crossroads in our nation. And I believe the moral issue of abortion on demand is the moral issue, just like abolition was the moral issue at the time of the Civil War. I believe that that sits at the very crux of what is happening in our culture, and it troubles me. Recently, we have heard a lot about the 1619 Project, and it has attempted to place the blame for slavery on America's founding, and particularly upon the first arrival of slaves from Africa in the colony at Jamestown. There are some problems historically with that particular viewpoint, and many historians have pointed out that there are a lot of misconceptions in the way in which this has been structured. Certainly those slaves arrived in 1619, but from every indication from historical documentation, those slaves were treated like any other indentured servants that arrived from Europe in Jamestown. It was only about 25 years later that slaves began to be held in perpetuity because of their color. And that is, I do not excuse that. I just want to be clear historically on what happened. As Christians, we need to be careful that we follow a very clear pattern. There have been a lot of Christians, even in our culture presently, that would like to excuse abortion. And they would excuse it basically on the same arguments that were used to excuse enslavement of Black people in the southern part of the United States during the antebellum period. The argument runs very much the same, and it is just as appalling now as it was then. We cannot treat human beings in that manner, no matter what their circumstances are. And that is what really troubles me as a Christian. Slavery in our country was quite different than slavery in the ancient world. And I know a lot of people have attacked Christianity because in the New Testament it talks about the proper role between masters and slaves. But the slavery that existed in the Roman world was quite distinct and different from the slavery that existed in the United States. The distinction was that Roman people did not view their slaves as distinctly different from them as far as their humanity goes. In addition, they did not practice slavery based on color of skin. Slavery in their culture happened to be the result of one of three things. Either you were a slave because of debt in your life and you were enslaved because of that reason, or you were enslaved because of conquest. The Romans had conquered you, or someone they bought you from had conquered you and sold you into slavery. Or you were a prisoner or a political liability, and the Romans enslaved you for that reason. Now, those types of slavery were very different. Very often, Roman slaves were very highly educated and very highly sought after. Many of the professionals in the Roman world were slaves. Many clerks, many people who took care of the household, many people who taught the children, professional teachers, even some physicians were slaves in their world. In addition, cooks, bakers, very often merchants, and store owners or storekeepers were slaves. In fact, they were often set up by their masters to run those businesses as slaves. And that was part of the situation. Very often there was a deal made with the slave that if after so many years or after they had turned so much profit, the slave would be freed and essentially receive the business. So there was an investment sense in that. Other slaves were treated quite harshly. Very often many of those involved in prostitution were enslaved, and that was terrible and horrible in their world. There were also slaves that were involved in mining, but most of those slaves actually were criminals or they were political prisoners. They were sent to the mines for one reason, to work until they died, and that was the intent of the Romans. And so very seldom were valuable slaves sent into the mines. It was normally those who the Romans saw as being a political or social liability. Debt slavery was actually outlawed for Roman citizens. Roman citizens could not be debt slaves in the Roman world. Other people could be debt slaves, but Roman citizens could not be taken in to debt slavery. In addition, that was also something the Hebrew people believed in. Very strongly in the Old Testament, it talks about the fact that Israelite people cannot be placed in debt slavery by their fellow Israelites. The other thing is that slavery within the Old Testament had very strict limitations, and that slavery required that slaves be treated fairly, or at least more fairly within the Israelite culture than they were treated in many other cultures around the Israelites. The Romans also began to treat their slaves much better after the first major slave revolt in the Roman Empire that took place about 100 years before Christ. There were laws and principles put in place within the Roman world to protect slaves from masters who were extremely abusive. And so there were things that were different about their particular culture. That doesn't make their slavery good or right, but to compare the slavery that is talked about in the Bible to the slavery that was happening in this country in the 1800s and before is to talk about apples and oranges. They were very, very different circumstances. Paul makes it very clear that Christians did not approve of slavery. In fact, the New Testament makes that extremely clear. They were working within the reality of the world they lived in. And because of that, they encouraged a person, if they were a slave, to view themselves as a freeman and to handle themselves in a responsible way as if they were a freeman. They also encouraged, or Paul encouraged, slaves that if they had the opportunity, by all means take advantage of becoming free. If they could buy their freedom, buy it. If they could get someone to help them buy their freedom, help them. Take whatever opportunity you can to get free, Paul indicates. He also indicates in 1 Timothy that slaves, a person who is not a slave, who's a Christian, should not sell themselves into debt slavery. He was very strict about that. Christians belong to Christ and should not belong to anyone else. And that is a powerful truth for us. It's one of the truths that Christians during the 1800s in this country began to grab hold of after what is called the Second Great Awakening. After the Second Great Awakening, there was the concept that the slave that came from Africa was as much or as important to God as any other person. And as a Christian, it was not my right or my privilege to take advantage of that person. I was responsible not to do that, according to Christians in the Second Great Awakening. It led to what's called the Holiness Movement during the 1840s. The Holiness Movement became rabidly abolitionist. They strongly advocated for the freedom of slaves. In fact, they would march, they would create civic disturbances to the point that it frustrated many of the professional class in this country, because many of the professional class believed in what was called scientific racism. The idea was that there were 4, sometimes 6 different racial categories, and in the 1600s, this concept began to develop in Europe. It was in direct opposition to traditional Christianity. It was part of the Enlightenment. It was the idea that you could divide all humanity up into different races. And when they talked about and used the word race, they meant different species, because those terms were used interchangeably. They did not believe that all human beings came from the same family, from Adam and Eve. They believed that they came from different backgrounds. And so they did not believe that humans were equal. In fact, most of them believed that people of a different color, particularly that weren't white, were inferior. Intellectually, emotionally, in some cases physically. They believed all of that, and which is ridiculous in any way of thinking. But that was the scientific view and the intellectual view and the enlightened view. That grew until the 1800s. It was further strengthened by what is called the Hegelian dialectic. The Hegelian dialectic actually gives birth to the concept of evolution. Both social and biological evolution are given strength through the concept of the Hegelian dialectic, as is, believe it or not, communism. Karl Marx followed the Hegelian dialectic in his development of Marxism. So when you think about that, all of that comes out of the same Enlightenment concepts and ideas. In the 1840s, Christianity, after the Second Great Awakening, reacted very, very strongly against those ideas. And the Holiness Movement was one of the primary leaders of that. It believed very strongly that Christians needed to act like Christians and that all people came from the same basis. There wasn't really anything such as race in their concept. People were of different colors, but they were all of the same species or race. And so there was a very different idea that came up in that revivalist movement. Many of the abolitionists took public action to protect runaway slaves and people who were of color, who were trying to protect themselves. And so that was part of that movement. And it's very often hidden in our present culture. That division in the 1840s would lead to a severe difference of opinion in our culture. And by the 1850s, the dividing lines in our culture were very sharp. You either believed in slavery and the good that you perceived in our culture because of it, primarily because it brought a lot of wealth and power, or you believed that it was inconsistent with Christian beliefs. And as a result of that, there was very little wiggle room in the middle for anybody on that issue. That's why by the 1850s, many people believed we were headed for civil war, because there was no wiggle room. The moral issue was clear. In 1973, the issue of abortion was not very clear. There were a lot of people that had lots of different ideas, lots of Christians that had different ideas about that. But as it has progressed to this point, the battle lines are drawn pretty clearly. This is a major issue, and it is a major moral issue in our culture. We are not going to get out of this one without solving it. I don't know how it will be solved, but I am thoroughly convinced it must be solved. And if it isn't, it will lead us probably past the same bright lines that happened in the 1850s. I don't look forward to that. I don't want that. But I am thoroughly convinced that this issue is that important in our world. There are a lot of people who are right now making tough decisions about whether to keep a child. I want to appeal to you. That child growing inside of its mother is a human being. There is no other way to see that. If that child is a human being, that child deserves respect and honor and does not deserve to be thrown away for convenience. God created each and every one of us. There are three reasons why Christians from the very beginning were opposed to abortion. The first reason was that we are created as human beings in the image of God. We bear his image. The second thing was that God creates every human being or is involved in the creation of every human being in the womb. And that's in Psalm 139. It's in the book of Jeremiah. And it's also in the New Testament with the birth of John the Baptist and the birth of Jesus Christ. Every child in the womb is, to some extent, created through the work of God. And the third thing, especially for us as Christians, is that Jesus Christ became incarnate. He did not come as a fully developed human being. He was conceived and he was born and he walked the earth and he died. In that act, he sanctified human life from conception to death. And that has been a Christian view since the very beginning. That's why Christians are pro-life. That's why we believe that human life is sacred. I want you to think about that. Father, I pray now for all those who are making tough decisions today. Lord, I ask you to help them make the right decision. I ask you to help them to give life and to protect life. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you.